Hello, I'm Mary Smith, President of the American Bar Association. Welcome to the final edition of the ABA Presidential Speaker Series. Under the theme, Lifting Our Voices, Charting the Future, we are joined by two distinguished guests whose insights into global affairs will undoubtedly enrich our understanding of this complex world. And it is particularly fitting that our final episode focuses on democracy and our obligations as lawyers and citizens. Richard Haass is a renowned diplomat, seasoned public servant, President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, and member of the ABA Task Force for American Democracy. Guiding the discussion is David Westin, anchor of Bloomberg Wall Street Week and former president of ABC News. David?
Thanks so much, Mary, and thank you, Richard, for joining us today. I really am looking forward to this discussion. This is sort of the year of elections all around the globe, not just in the United States, but all around the globe. There are a lot of elections, even more than we thought we would have with some of the snap elections. But let's focus for the moment on the United States. A lot is at stake every 4 years when we elect the president, a third of the Senate, all the House. But is there something more at stake this time, in your view?
You're right. It is the year of elections. There's already been quite a few. It's been a rough year by and large for incumbents, which I think tells you something about the moment where we're living in. There's been a few surprises. That said, the American election is disproportionately important simply because the United States has had and continues to have an outsized role in the world, given our influence, given our power. What's different about this election here, and I've thought a lot about it, is when you go back through, say, the last 75 years or even longer, in most American elections, presidential elections in particular, the similarities between the candidates was far greater than the differences. So yeah, at the time, we all focused on the differences, even say going back to 1964. I remember the Goldwater-Johnson election and the motto of it was a choice, not an echo. And people thought there were tremendous differences. I don't mean to downplay the significance if Barry Goldwater had won, but again, the similarities were far greater than the differences. I'm not sure you can say that this time. That's what I think distinguishes this election in the United States, is that the differences between the candidates arguably outweighs the similarities, which makes this extraordinarily consequential. And some of the same things could be said about potentially the congressional races, that as the center has been somewhat hollowed out in American politics, that the consequences of elections is greater because continuity cannot be assumed to the extent it was in the past.
So I want to go back to what you started with. This is a tough year for incumbents. It certainly has been around the world. We don't know what happens yet in the U.S. elections, but I wonder why you think that might be. There seems to be a level of dissatisfaction in the United States, in the polling certainly, maybe even anger. I don't want to go too far, but maybe even anger. And as you say, perhaps more polarity than we've had before. What are the causes of that? Why are people so disparate in their views, and why are they really upset about it?
Well, some things, David, I think are general, cross borders, and some things might be peculiar to the United States. Social media is a phenomenon everywhere. The breakup of media, we've gone from an era of broadcasting to narrowcasting. So I think that affects everybody around the world. It's except in the most authoritarian societies where elections are meaningless, like Russia or what have you, because increasingly various political parties or movements or individuals can get their voice out. You know, we're a slightly older generation. When we had 3 national television stations, we've come a long ways from that. So I think that's one thing. It's simply harder to generate consensus, harder to manage the flow of information. And I think that's a worldwide phenomenon. New technologies have been difficult for a lot of societies to absorb. Globalization has had a powerful impact. A lot of people feel unmoored. I think also around the world, particularly in Europe and the United States, we've seen the power of immigration. Large numbers of people, and you look at the recent European parliamentary elections, I would say that immigration in places like Germany and France and so forth have had tremendous impact. So then when we turn to the United States, again, immigration, the whole problem at the border has had a large role. Economic issues here and elsewhere. The fact that a lot of people feel the pressure of inflation, every time they go to the supermarket, they're reminded that the staples cost more than they used to. They're not as confident about their jobs. The idea that people, of an older generation might have the same job, or the ratio of jobs to career might have been close to 1-to-1, and now it might be 20-to-1. But that's a very different, much more turbulent, more demanding life, and people obviously feel pressured. So I think all of that is added to pressure against incumbents, which is part of the pressure against Joe Biden. And then again, there's some things that are truly particular questions about his age and the rest of his fitness to be president. All those kinds of issues, which are uniquely American and uniquely about this election.
Richard, as you go back through some of those elections you and I have both lived through, there have been differences, even some substantial differences sometimes with the candidates. But one thing this year that at least I don't recall before, is we have the incumbent president saying that democracy is on the ballot. And the former president may not be saying exactly that, but saying things that are pretty close to that really this is a question about the heart and soul of the country. Is that just campaign hyperbole, or is there something to it?
I'm sorry to say there's something to it, David. Democracy is not explicitly on the ballot, but it's implicitly. We don't know to what extent, because it's hard to know what Mr. Trump would do if he were elected. We know what he says. This is a question of what he would try to do, and this is the question of what he could do, and to what extent. What would the Congress would look like? Do you have Republicans regaining control of the Senate? Do Republicans keep the House, or do Democrats take the House, and so forth? So it's a little bit hard to know what will be the context. But yes, when you have a candidate who talks about the previous presidential election having been quote unquote rigged, already raising alarms or predictions that this one will be as well, or particularly almost by definition, if he were to lose. Some of his statements suggest that by definition, that means it would have been rigged. When he talks about what he would do in government, it raises questions about the weaponization or politicization of everything from the civil service to the justice machinery, something and a lot of our listeners here know a lot more about than I do. Look, a lot of what makes a democracy, I've come to think, is not the Constitution or laws, because documents only take you so far. At the end of the day, what gives resilience to a democracy is really norms, and the willingness to abide by norms really becomes a question of temperament and character. There's nothing in the Constitution or in laws that says you have to do this. You have to ride in the limousine down Pennsylvania Avenue to attend the swearing in of a successor who defeated you. But that's one of the things that differentiate an American democracy from others, or how you deal with the media. Whether you accept it as Jefferson did as an important component of democracy, or whether you see the media as something of an enemy when it disagrees with you or criticizes you, how you talk about your opponent, what degree of respect or disrespect do you evoke in your choice of language. And that's the stuff of democracy. You can't legislate it. You can't make it mandatory. There's no legal penalties if you violate it. But again, I think that's clearly in the air as Americans ultimately will go to the polls this November.
Richard, I wonder about your thoughts on how we got here. I mean, you've spent your career as a diplomat and a real expert in international affairs. More recently, you've turned your focus more domestically, really, in the United States with the Bill of Obligations, for example, your most recent book out. And I wonder, as you look at this splintering, if I can put it that way, of much of the American electorate, how much of it is structural? That is to say, some things that we've done, for example, primaries, pick one example that's often picked on. And how much of it is a response to some of the things we've been through, whether it's the great financial crisis or the pandemic. There have been a lot of things done that have really exacerbated some of the disparities in income and wealth in the country.
The short and glib answer is both. We have all sorts of structural things, gerrymandering, closed primaries, and so forth, that have increased polarization. The problem is, David, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, it's very hard to fix those things, because no matter what you propose in the way of reform, there will always be groups and individuals that conclude that those changes will hurt them. And shockingly enough, it's good you're sitting down, that those who conclude a proposed reform would work against their interests will oppose it. And that's what we see. when it comes to gerrymandering, closed primaries, the electoral college, the entire relationship between territory, population, and voting might. If one, clearly large population states are disadvantaged in the electoral college and in the Senate, but it's very hard to, indeed, it's impossible in many cases to bring about change there, because those who, again, conclude the change wouldn't be in their political self-interest. I think it's harder to build consensus. It's harder to create a sense of collective or national interest. This is an age much more of special interest. That's not new. We've always had that, but I think the intensity of it is probably greater than it was. And now I've gone on so long, I forgot your specific question. So I apologize.
No. You answered it actually beautifully, if I can say so. But I also wonder, again, before we turn to what we might do to fix it, because you're going to fix all this before we're done here, I'm sure, Richard. But how much of this is because we no longer have some of the institutions we had before that would force us together to deal with people with different points of view? I mean, one easy example, perhaps, frankly, is the draft.
Sure.
Universal military conscription. You've got put together rich and poor and people from different parts of the country. A lot of those have broken down. And as you talk about the media, if anything, has exasperated that. We can go to our respective corners and just talk to other people that we agree with.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me focus on two public policies, the weakness of which have made it worse. One, you just mentioned, David, which is public service. Public service used to be a great bringing together tool. When Tom Brokaw would speak of and write of the greatest generation, one of the great things about the draft was it brought people together in America who never would normally come together. The rich, the poor, people from the north, the south, Christians, Jews, Muslims, white, blacks, urban, rural, you name it. And they would come together, they'd live together, they'd fight together. In some cases, they would die together. But it would forever change the way they saw their fellow American. It gave them some common experience. And that's very American. This is a country that was founded on ideas and ideals that were common, rather than just on race or gender or religion or what have you. So I'm not advocating for bringing back the draft. Americans don't like mandates. They don't like to be told what they have to do. But public service is something we could and should bring back to a much greater degree. It could be military. Obviously, we have the all-volunteer force. But also, it's things like the Peace Corps or domestic variants of it. The state of California has introduced several public service programs. It's incentivized young people to join them. So again, it's a great way to bring people together. It's also a great training tool. And it's also a great way to break the divide between individuals and their government. So I like it on so many levels. And I've advocated that employers and schools give preferences to young people who go through those programs. That's one thing we can and should do. Every state could do it. We could do much more at the national level on this. The White House recently took an idea from California, the Climate Corps, and has made it a national program. So things like that. Secondly, civics. We have got to do a much better job of teaching civics in our high schools and colleges, maybe even younger than high schools, middle schools. If I had my way, David, it would be impossible to graduate from a high school or college in this country without having taken civics. We would never imagine allowing someone to graduate if he or she couldn't read, write, think critically, get online, and so forth. Well, why do we allow people to graduate? Why do we think they're ready to, if you will, we call it commencement for a reason, to begin? Why do we believe they're ready if they're not aware of their rights, if they're not aware of their obligations, if they're not aware of their inheritance in a country, why democracies are valuable, what democracies require of their citizens if they're going to succeed? So, we can and should have a thoughtful conversation about the content of a civics curriculum. I've got a lot of views on that. I'm sure a lot of people watching this also have views and a lot to offer to that conversation. But we need that conversation. I mean, you alluded to my book before. That's why I wrote the book. I wanted to start a national conversation in this country about our obligations to the government, to the country on one hand, and our obligations to one another. And one of the ways I believe we develop this sense of obligation to country and to our fellow citizens is through the teaching of civics. We shouldn't assume that this political inheritance is that we're born with it. We've got to teach it. We've got to be intentional about it. We've got to be purposeful about it. It's got to be a priority. And again, one of the things I'm trying to do is kindle something of a national conversation about it.
Well, Richard, your writing of the book, Bill of Obligations, I know was just the beginning. You're sort of on a campaign for this around the country. And I guess my question, to pick up on what you said if you had your way, it would be mandatory in all high schools. Why don't you have your way? I mean, of all the things we might talk about in this country, why is that controversial? After all, we required of people to become citizens. They have to study all those questions and answer some of those questions about how we work. Why is that controversial? This is not about putting books in the library, taking books out of the library, about sex education, any of those things.
The citizenship test, the 100 questions or whatever it is, and you get a number of those. Most American citizens couldn't answer the questions on the exam that we put before individuals, men and women who want to become citizens. If that doesn't, if that's not a flashing yellow light that we've got a problem on our hands, I don't know what is. I don't think there was an anti-civics movement. I've done a little bit of research on this, David. I think it was a little bit of musical chairs that we kept insisting there were more requirements, STEM and other things. And what happened with civics, it got a little bit squeezed out. It got a little bit crowded out of the conversation. Also, it demands a lot of the teachers who have to teach it, and teacher training in this country is not one of our national strengths. Let me just be blunt about that. We spend way too much time, I would argue, on pedagogy, not nearly enough time on substance and subjects and content. And also, let's be realistic. To the extent there is a renewed focus on civics education, I hope there will be. I don't underestimate that it will be difficult to get consensus. We saw some of the battles over history, over race, and so forth. So I think we can anticipate that. I have some personal experience with this when I was the U.S. envoy to Northern Ireland to the peace talks, and when I went back and tried to promote greater cooperation among the leading political parties. I tried to promote some of these ideas in Northern Ireland. For example, a common curriculum in the schools to teach the history of the so-called Troubles there, the 3 decades of politically inspired violence. And I didn't get very far. And one of the things I learned from that is that it's important. You have to teach people about the principal events, expose them to the principal documents and all that. We could easily do that here. You cannot try to impose a single vision or version of history. What I think you have to do is expose people to various legitimate interpretations and analyses of history, let them come to their own conclusion. But I don't think this is beyond the wit of man. And I would like to see, it become a priority. I think it would help with some of the big, well-heeled foundations made this a priority. And the public sector lacks resources. This would take resources to train teachers, to get it into schools. So this is something that foundations could usefully take on. Wealthy Americans could take this on. Some corporations could help here. But I think we need something of a grassroots movement to make this happen.
Richard, I want to talk to something else that is near and dear to the hearts of anyone who belongs to the ABA, and that's the rule of law. There's also a lot of talk about whether that's on the ballot this November, about whether we really believe in the rule of law or not. First of all, talk about the rule of law and its role in sort of keeping us together, knitting us together. You said it's not just the Constitution, but there is, of course, a common law going well back, well before the Constitution, that has sort of knitted us together, a country of very disparate people from very different countries, different languages, different traditions, has historically knitted us together. How much of a risk is there right now, in your opinion, to the rule of law?
Well, I almost wish that was a question that you would answer yourself. You've thought about it. You've had a distinguished career, both in the legal world as well as in the media world. The way I see the rule of law, David, and disagree with me, if you will, is it's not something we talk about normally. I think for a long time we had the luxury of kind of assuming it. And to me, it's a little bit like oxygen. It's really critical for our welfare, for our well-being. And anyone doubting it, just, we don't do very well when we're denied adequate oxygen, whether we're underwater or in an airplane when it loses pressure or what have you. And that's how I feel about the rule of law. We've assumed we had it. We assumed it would always be here. And what we're seeing is it's probably coming under greater pressure. So far, it's largely held. We've had recent some controversial trials, whether the trial of Donald Trump in New York or the trial of Hunter Biden. And these were two high-profile people. In both cases, juries did what juries are meant to do. We still have widespread acceptance that the rule of law ought to be followed, needs to be obeyed. There ought to be or need to be consequences, but if for those who break it. But it's not as strong as I'd like to see it. Let me give you two recent examples. There's a lot of talk from Donald Trump about pardoning the January 6th, what I would call insurrectionists. Others might have other words for it. And my view is no. These people broke the law in what they did. They had a fair legal process. And what the rule of law is process, not results. You can't be in favor of the rule of law when you like the verdict and oppose it when you don't. Or more recently, we've seen on campuses with students. So a lot of students at various campuses broke the law, whether law about trespassing or vandalism or what have you, or in some cases broke not the rule of law in the technical sense, but the rules that universities set for themselves. And now there's suddenly a movement, a drop the charges movement. And I look at that and I go, no, it doesn't work that way. Thank you very much. We have laws and they're meant to be followed. If you don't like them, there's ways of trying to change the law through the political process. And by the way, you can break the law, but then you have to be prepared to pay the consequences. That's the whole tradition of Thoreau, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and others, is civil disobedience. And it's almost as if the present generation of protesters never read any of these people. So they're prepared to break the law, but not to pay the fines or be suspended from school or what have you. And again, you've got to, the rule of law first requires following the law, but then for whatever reason, if you don't, you've got to then agree to accept the charges.
Richard, as you say, it's sort of like oxygen. We almost assume that it's there. I also wonder, I'd love your thoughts on this, the extent to which we tend to think of the rule of law in the political sphere and not the economic sphere. But in fact, people who are involved in financial transactions, whether it's a contract being enforced, the way financial markets work, or the way stocks and bonds work, everything else, it's based on an assumption that we will have courts we can appeal to, and we sort of know how they're going to come out more or less.
Oh, absolutely. Without the rule of law with markets cease to function. If people didn't have confidence that what was being disclosed was accurate, or that markets essentially were operating as markets rather than being manipulated by this or that, or insider trading is a perfect example. It's a pernicious force because it means that the playing field isn't level. So people then lose confidence in the markets and in investing in the rule. So the rule of law turns out to be essential. But to me, what's so critical about the rule of law is the level playing field metaphor, David. It's equal opportunity. There's an equality, not of outcome, but a process. And that to me is what has to be. If there's a sense that it's not equal, that it's tilted or favoring some, then people lose faith in the system. And when people lose faith in the system, then they go outside the system. And that becomes dangerous. That's the path to either widespread law breaking or violence or what have you. None of it's good. So it's important that the rule of law operate and be seen to operate. And we tear it down. We denigrate it. I think at our collective peril. It's one of those things, maybe again, coming back to the oxygen metaphor, that we will miss it dearly if it comes to play a less central role in our day-to-day lives.
Richard, as you referred to, the courts have come under a lot of pressure from various directions, and I mean state and federal as well. And goodness knows we have an awful lot of courts in this country at this point. But overall, do you think they've stood up pretty well? And I'll put the Supreme Court at the top of it because it's under a lot of pressure as well. By and large, do you think they've stood up and have brought us together and have come up with decisions we can all get behind, or have they become more politicized themselves?
I hope at some point you stop holding back. Answer your own questions, but the short answer is they have become more politicized, and I think they've come to be perceived as more politicized, and that's dangerous. The history of the United States is often one in which the court, and the Supreme Court in particular, emerges as the tiebreaker. It's something of the venue of last resort. So when we can't sort certain things out, we go to the courts, and there's an implicit, respect for its decision. You may not like the decision, but pretty central to the American political tradition is that we accept the verdicts of the Supreme Court, whether they fit with our preferences or not. And the danger, if that begins to fade, and I fear it has, then it suggests to me when courts issue verdicts, they're not accepted, and the fight goes on. And if the fight goes on, well, then what are you looking at? It could be violence, or you could have essentially a version of nullification, where if the court rules in certain ways, say on abortion, and in certain states that decision is seen as far too restrictive, I can imagine situations where you would have widespread breaking of the law in certain states, or even where state government or state authorities would support the breaking of the law, as the Supreme Court has ruled. And that, again, that sets us down a very dangerous path. I do think the Supreme Court, again, I'm out of my depth here. The idea that I'm talking about this, a non-lawyer, with you on a podcast for the American Bar Association, we've now reached into something that's preposterous on steroids. I don't even play lawyers on TV, but I am worried. If you look at certain decisions, Dobbs and the rest, a certain lack of respect for precedent, willingness to rule farther than the specific case actually requires. There's all the questions about recusal, or more accurately, non-recusal, that certain justices are allowing their political agendas to inform their legal behavior. And putting all the specifics aside, what worries me about that is we've clearly moved to an area now in American political life, to a moment where respect for the court's legitimacy is less than it was. And I would say less than it should be or needs to be, because we face all sorts of difficult decisions. And I worry about an America where the court makes controversial decisions, and it's not simply that the decisions are disliked by a big chunk of America. That's not new. We've had that many times. What's different is that the legitimacy of the court to make those decisions is not accepted widely. And that's a place I don't want to get, because I worry about where that leads.
So the only thing I'll quibble with you about the preposterous comment, because when we're talking about the rule of law, the appearance of a neutrality and a respectability is terribly important. And sometimes the legal profession can be too inbred, in my opinion, and can get too caught up in its own details of what it's doing. And we need an outside view from an informed person such as you about exactly what's going on. So I think that's probably one last thing, and that you'll probably really resist this, is to preach to lawyers. What is the role of lawyers in this? I mean, it's not just the courts, it's also the lawyers. We are officers of the court. I still have my bar card, believe it or not. And we're officers of the court. We have certain obligations as well. And we've gotten into something that now is being called lawfare in some places, where lawyers are really going in and filing complaints. And there have been some, as you know, disciplinary proceedings against them. But what can the lawyers do to sort of make sure that we maintain that rule of law?
Look, I wrote a book with the word obligations in the title. And I say that not to sell the book, it's doing just fine. But obligations are an important part of democracy. We're so fixated on our rights, and lawyers, like any other citizen, have rights to do things. But I say that as officers of the court, people who have received this rather special education, people to whom we entrust certain valuable functions in our society, people who are intimately connected with the rule of law, which, as we've just discussed, is so, central, critical for democracy. I would say they have obligations that go above and beyond to support the rule of law, and to be mindful of, that they've got multiple obligations. I guess the analogy that comes to mind, if I'm out of line here, David, correct me. With CEOs, there's been a long debate about whether they're only concerned with shareholder return. And in recent years and decades, there's been the argument, no, that CEOs and companies have additional concern, responsibilities, or obligations, whether it's to their workers, whether it's to their consumers, whether it's to the society at large. So they have an obligation to get return for their shareholders, but that's not an absolute, and it's certainly not the sole obligation. One of their obligations, by the way, is to adhere to the law. And I would say the same thing for lawyers, that they have multiple obligations here. And they've also got, look, a lot of lawyers, whether they practice law or in other professions, they are often in positions of some influence and some prestige in their communities. And at a time where the rule of law, at the time where democracy is under more than a little bit of pressure, a non-lawyer such as myself would say, hey, you've got to model certain behaviors. You've got to make certain arguments. If not you, then who? I mean, I feel that, I feel certain obligations, say, when it comes to debating America's role in the world. That's what I was trained to do. That's what I was educated to do. And I've been doing it for half a century. So when there are public debates, I feel a certain obligation to get involved and explain, in some ways more to explain than to advocate. And I would say the same thing for lawyers, that they've got a broad set of commitments in this society to help us work our way through some very difficult, controversial things, rather than be blindly political and pure advocates. I expect more and better of lawyers.
So Richard, here in the last few minutes, let's turn from the diagnosis to the prescription. I'll refer once more to the Bill of Obligations, because as I recall that last chapter, you lay out some things you think that we could do that would at least make things better. Maybe not fix them overnight, maybe not fix them in the long term, but at least make them better, get us closer together. Give us an idea of what we should be focused on to try to improve things.
Two I've alluded to, and we've discussed already, David, was public service, essentially expanding public service opportunities in this country, which I think would be wonderful educations, but also ways of bringing Americans together who would normally not interact. We've become way too siloed as a society, way too separate. We've also discovered civics. Parents, people watching this, whether they're professors, whether they're parents, whether they're administrators, but they should be advocates for this, should be part of the curriculum. And we debate whether foreign language or sciences or English lit, what have you, are in the curriculum or are offered up. Well, why isn't this offered up? And then we can talk about how to make sure the quality is what it needs to be. Something that's been more recent, I've been thinking a lot about is I think that universities should institute, related to this, a program for all returning students, whether they're a new student or a returning student. Say a one-day seminar in late August, early September, whenever students show up on campus, about how to debate and navigate difficult issues on campus. What is free speech? What are the limits to free speech? How does the right of speech intersect with the right of someone to go to class or attend a commencement or hear a speaker with controversial views and so forth? That's something that every school, every one of them could do that. And then again, the people watching this, there's all sorts of ways we model certain behaviors. The idea of being involved, well, voting. More than half of eligible voters didn't bother to vote in the last midterm elections. A third of eligible voters, if history's a guide, won't vote in this presidential election, despite the differences and the stakes. Getting informed, not going to TikTok to get informed, but going to serious media sources that are fact-checked, or going to multiple sources. No one would just go to one doctor if they had a serious problem. Well, our democracy has a serious problem. We need to go to multiple sources of authoritative information in order to get informed. So there's practices we can do. So again, I don't leap, David, when you ask that question, to massive reforms. I don't think the time is ripe for massive political reforms. We simply don't have the consensus. But there are things that we can do, if you will, below that, at a grassroots level, that I think would add to the resilience of American democracy. And I want to circle back to one thing you said: democracy's on the ballot. I'll speak personally. When I voted last time in the midterms, to me there was a real tension between my policy preferences and my democracy preferences. And I think every voter has to think about, what comes first? Is it your democracy preferences or your policy preferences? Or how do you at least balance the two? And once or twice I swallowed hard, and I was willing to put my democracy preferences before my policy preferences. I'm not saying that's the right answer all the time or the right answer for everyone, but I think it's a useful mental process to go through, because policies can change, but once democracies get weaker, I think it's more difficult to bring them back. I don't know that for sure, but I do know I don't want to have an experiment that tests that hypothesis.
One thing that strikes me in listening to you on that list of things that we could and should do, I think every one of them, maybe I missed one, is I would say bottom up rather than top down. You didn't say we need Congress to do this, we need the president to do that. It was a bottom up. Because I was going to ask, how do we give incentives to our elected officials to try to do some of these things?
Right.
But it sounds like you think really it should be grassroots, as you say, moving up rather than starting at the top and moving down.
I do, because that we can control our own behaviors. The only way to give incentives to elected officials is to reward them for doing what you believe is the responsible thing, and to penalize them for not. One of my favorite lines about politicians is they're not always responsible, but they're always responsive. And my guess is they will find their way to do the right thing. If a majority of voters essentially signals, they will only be supported if they do, quote unquote, the right thing. So that's up to us. So the best way to bring about top-down reforms or behaviors that are desirable is for a bottom-up response, to hold those in a representative democracy who do wield significant power, that we hold them accountable. So again, it comes back to the bottom up though, David. It's on us. It's on us to get informed first, and then to get involved, whether it's voting, other forms of political activity. It's still we the people. And it's still on us to hold those accountable, to hold their feet, quite bluntly, to the fire. And they, my own view is they will be encouraged to do responsible things if it is shown, if it's clear what the consequences would be if they do not.
So, Richard, I want to return to a conversation you and I have had through the years back when you were working on the book. And I guess the basic question is, how concerned are you? Obviously, you're concerned. There's no question about that. But how bad is it? Is this a matter of just a cycle? We go up, we go down. There are things that happen. Or is there something more fundamental here about our systems? Because certainly you and I have had this conversation about 1968 was a pretty bad year in all sorts of directions. Is this worse than we've seen before? Or is it different? Is there something more at stake?
It's a question I've asked myself a lot, David. My own sense is it is a little bit different, and it is a little bit worse. And you mentioned 68, it was an awful year with the assassinations, the protests. But those were more things that took place within American democracy, or they were about policy. I see some of the things going on now are bigger than that, or more fundamental than that. So that worries me. In any case, I'm not sanguine, whether I'm right or wrong in that. I'm the old Churchill line, Americans can always be counted on to do the right thing, but only after they've tried everything else. Okay, but that's sanguine. And one of the lessons I take from recent years is we don't have the luxury of being sanguine. I'm not being an alarmist. I'm not predicting that the worst will happen, but I'm also not 100% certain that bad things won't happen. We had a taste of political violence over the last few years. Even now, we see all sorts of public officials, officers of the court, elected officials threatened. That's something, it seems to me, that's qualitatively different. So I think the lessons are, there's warnings out there. The system is flashing a bit of yellow. It might be particularly bad now because it's been a rough 20 years, from 9/11, the financial crises, two very unsuccessful foreign wars, COVID. So it might be a little bit worse simply because of the circumstances of the past two decades. But however bad it is, it's bad enough. And so I take it seriously as a moment in history, and I read the polls, and I see certain indications that a lot of Americans are not persuaded that democracies deliver. They're not persuaded that democracies are all that preferable to alternatives. This is a populist moment. What's so dangerous about populism is people are willing to trade the long term for the short term. And what I want to do is push against that, and basically say the long term. Here we are, David? We're literally 2 years away from the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. I'm not sure a lot of the founders thought we'd ever get that far. Good news is we've had. Well, I'd like to say we'll get to the 300, the 350th, and so forth and so on. And I just don't take it for granted. I'm not saying we won't. But it will take conscious collective effort. And that's the point. That we can debate exactly how bad the situation is or isn't. I don't know. You don't know. But the fact that we're having the debate is a bit of a warning sign. It's a bit of an uncomfortable sign. We're having the conversation. So my takeaway from that is don't assume the best. I'm not saying assume the worst, but we've got to get involved to see that the needle moves more in the direction of the good and away from the problematic. That ought to be the takeaway. This country has accomplished amazing things at home and abroad when people have gotten involved and have done. We're a much changed, and I would argue much better society than we were. And the last 75 years, in no small part because of American leadership, are an unprecedented period of global accomplishment. Not perfect, but unprecedented. It will be, indeed, I would predict it will be looked back as something of a golden age in the world in terms of democracy, health, the avoidance of great power conflict, and so forth. And my view is simply don't take good things for granted. And good things just don't happen. We learned that in science class. Order is not the natural way of things. Order requires input and effort, or otherwise randomness and entropy take over. And I think that's true of political systems as well. So no one should take this as a counsel of defeatism or despair. But on the other hand, no one should simply listen to this and be sanguine and say, those two guys don't know what they're talking about. Everything has worked out in the past. Everything will automatically work out well in the future. Maybe, but I think the stakes are too big to take that for granted.
And that, I may say, is a great closing argument, as we would say in the biz. Richard, thank you so much. That's Richard Haass, a Centerview Partners, former president of Council on Foreign Relations. Great to talk to you, Richard. And now, Mary, it's back to you.
Thank you so much, David and Richard, for giving us the opportunity to gain a deeper perspective into the issues that matter most to all of us, particularly American democracy. And if you have been inspired by these thought-provoking fireside chats over the past year, become an ABA member by going to ambar.org/membership. Thank you so much for joining us.